Greetings everyone. Today we'll be doing a video on Gargarian Deep Space, which is an ID that I'm increasingly looking towards for building a glacier-based deck. Now, Gargarian is one of the very few IDs in the game that actually forces the runner to lose credits, which is pretty cool and quite unique. The only other ID that I can think of that does this is Spark. This is pretty powerful because ice becomes all but irrelevant in the later stages of the game, meaning that upgrades do all the work in protecting your agendas. And when you talk about upgrades, there are very few that actually do any work. Outside of Jinteki faction, where you have Caprice and Betty, the only other viable upgrade is Ash. The other one would be off the grid, but that requires too much of a combo to work with any sort of reliability. So you're down to Ash, and Ash is only most effective when you can force the runner to lose credits such that it's easier to beat them with the Ash trace. And that is the whole premise of this deck. Keeping them poor enough to make Ash a very powerful force in defending your agendas. To be perfectly fair, I think Spark is a better ID for doing a hybrid Glacier FA deck because you have Astral Script Infection. But one big advantage of playing with Gargarian here is that you have access to some of the best multi-sub eyes in the game. Well, I wouldn't say it's the best. Tour Guide is actually an ice that I really don't like because of the fact that it can be easily insta-parasited, and we all know that almost every deck nowadays on the runner side runs Parasite. But when you stack up lots and lots of these low strength, high number of subroutines ice, such as Spiderweb, you get to a point where the runner cannot cope with Parasite Recursion anymore. It's just too much to handle. And once they start having to pay through all the multi-sub ice, that's where you come out ahead. So that's the premise of this deck. Spam multi-sub ice, they're pretty cheap, so you don't have to worry too much about the languishing economy of Gargarian, and take it from there. Alright, enough rambling on, let's get into the actual game, which I'm up against a wizard, so this is going to be pretty tricky. My ID ability and paywall implementation will still do great work, but now it gets more difficult because I cannot actually play any of these upgrades out in the open, unlike what I would do against any other ID. I would be able to play Expo Grid and wait for an asset to show up. Now I have to protect the Expo Grid because if he does run it, he's going to trash it, and for free, and I cannot allow him to do that. So I allow him to run through HQ, and he starts getting a card draw and Visage Engine going, which is pretty interesting. I did mention before that Drug Dealer is, when combined with Symmetrical Visage, essentially a worse version of Wildside, and he's actually using that in Anarch, where Wildside is free and Drug Dealer is not in terms of influence, so that really surprises me. In the meantime, he gets a Data Sucker going, and I do find my first few assets in the form of J-Howl and Public Support. Not the most ideal, neither of them are particularly good because I really want to see the pet campaign. So I do get a Public Support instead, and that goes in the remote, ready to take down the next turn. So he does react, he finally runs it, and I show him the Tour Guide. Now, Tour Guide has the number of subroutines based on number of rest assets you have. So in this case, he has 0 rest assets, he's going to get through for free. I can't have that, so I'm going to rest the Public Support here, which kind of sucks. I lose 2 credits. Yes, I do lose 2 credits from raising the Public Support. Maybe I should have placed a Jackson Howard in there instead, I don't know. Or maybe I should have played the Jackson Howard in the empty remote and forced him to run it. That's possible as well. In any case, he decides not to challenge it, and as a result, I get the Public Support off for 1 tick. In the meantime, I do find the pet campaign at long last, but I don't play it. As I said, Wizard is too good at denying my econ assets, and I want them to stay on the board, so I have to keep it in my hand and play it in the Public Support remote when he eventually does decide to go for it, which he does do at this point. After running my R&D and slamming into the Spiderweb, he now goes through my Tour Guide using Mimic, not Parasite, surprisingly. So he just trashes my Public Support. He doesn't have enough money to actually access and trash Expo Grid as well, so I'm going to abuse that by placing the pet campaign with the Expo Grid that he failed to trash, along with a new remote to increase the number of assets that I have available. It's an Expo Grid into Jackson Howard. If he decides to run my Tour Guide again, I'm going to show him the Jackson Howard for 2 subroutines. And if he decides to run my Naked Remote as it is, he won't have enough money to access and trash everything. So Drug Dealer is going to start working against him because he needs money to access my remotes, but he won't get too much money because Drug Dealer is sapping away at his credits. He's not at 0 credits. I'm also pretty poor, but at least my centrals are uh, uh, airtight as of now, because all he is a mimic. So this is actually a good time to begin scoring if I can actually find myself a scoring remote. Unfortunately for me, because he trashed my public support, I'm not able to get Archer off, which would have made a very nice secure scoring remote. So at this point, I place the Archer on the Jackson remote because it does seem like I'm going to start scoring in that remote once Jackson Howard gets out of the way. Also, I don't want him to come trashing my expo grid for free. I can't have that happen. Unfortunately, he plays a current of his own right here, Hacktivist Meeting. It's a bit late to the party, but late is better than never. Not only does it get rid of my paywall, it also prevents me from raising any other assets or upgrades without taking a serious hit. And that's bad news. Very, very bad news. So I would want to score the Atlas in my hand ASAP, even if it's for 0 advancement counters. I need to wipe out the Hacktivist Meeting ASAP because raising upgrades and assets is a key part to my strategy. I do run team sponsorship in this deck, so I definitely want that to fire. Let's see what he does here. He runs my Archer remote. I cannot res Archer, so I have to let him trash my stuff, but not before I get the Jackson Howard off, because it seems like he's coming for my Howard, not my Expo grid. And he does trash my Expo grid. Now I want to shuffle stuff back with Jackson Howard, especially the Ash, which he trashed from my hand earlier for free, thanks to the wizard credits, which is pretty annoying. Then he gets a Corroder in, so now that begins to spell trouble for me. I do have 2 Atlases in my hand right now, so I'm going to start scoring with Betty to protect my remote. And a Merumati for extra safety. So basically the goal here is to wipe out Hacktivist Meeting at the soonest opportunity. So here he runs my remote with 2 credits. I can easily keep him out, but here I make a fatal mistake. I do not res the Merumati. I should have res the Merumati here. Each of the eyes in that remote will tax him for 1 credit. He has 2 credits, which means that he'll be drained of credits by the time he reaches the base of the remote. I should have res both eyes. Instead, I res the Marcus Betty and played the side game, which was a big mistake. I did this because I thought Tour Guide had 2 subroutines, but it only had 1 because the Jackson Howard was forced out earlier. So whoops, big mistake. This cost me my Marcus Betty, which is really unfortunate. Yeah, so this is pretty awful. So here I get a completely agenda flooded in hand, which is horrible. I do not want to be agenda flooded at this point because he has his entire breaker suite out, which means that he can actually waltz through my HQ and steal 4 points right off the bat. And it's the most valuable 4 points in my deck, the remaining 2 Atlases. I can't have that. But thankfully he finds a better solution for him, or what seems to be a better solution, in the form of free R&D digs with medium after parasiting down my spider web. So good for him, and also good for me, because this deflects attention from HQ, where all the key agendas are. So here I draw into Corporate Town, which looks pretty nice, but I need to see ice on R&D right now. I draw once, I don't see any ice. I know he has seen 3 cards off the top of R&D. Do I attempt to draw again and hope that I hit an ice? I don't know. Do I? It is very risky. If I don't hit ice here, I'm completely doomed. Seeing that I have team sponsorship and Corporate Town in hand, and knowing that he knows I have them, I'm going to bluff it out. I'm going to install 2 assets here, allow him to R&D dig because I know that he won't see too many agendas because I'm quite agenda flooded right now. And there's a global food initiative in archives that he doesn't know about. It got milled with Hacktivist Meeting when I attempted to res the Marcus Betty earlier, if you remember. So here I'm going to fake it out. I'm going to pretend that the asset in the tour guide remote is actually a Corporate Town, when it is in fact a Project Atlas. He doesn't know that I have 2 Project Atlases in my hand. So I'll lead him to believe that that's a Corporate Town. In the meantime, he can run through my entire R&D, which is pretty painful. He's going to get 7 medium tokens by the end of this. There's nothing I can do about it, except to perhaps draw an additional card and hope to see ice, but that's a gamble. So I'm going to let him have it. Double Oak Town, I very soon find myself teetering on match point. He's going to win if he finds any more agendas. there is a 3-pointer in my deck that isn't Global Food Initiative, so I'm pretty worried about that. But he spares me after a medium deck and goes for Hacktivist Meeting instead, which is pretty nice. It means that I can actually fire off Atlas from my remote. And the next card in my deck turned out to be a hedge fund. So thankfully I didn't draw. Had I drawn on the last turn, I would have found myself in a very bad position. So here what I do is to find Spiderweb again from my archives, using team sponsorship to score the Atlas, clearing the Hacktivist Meeting, and installing the Spiderweb to slow him down. With 0 credits, thanks to Drug Dealer, he cannot run R&D again. What he could do is to click for 3 credits and run R&D to pay through with Corroder and see 7 cards. That is perfectly possible. He's not going to do that. Instead, he's going to solidify his economy with KD Jones. Raising the team sponsorship did cost me my hedge fund though, because there was Hacktivist Meeting available. So that cost me 4 credits, which is pretty painful. But now that I found Paywall and a Corporate Town, I can go to town on his KD Jones. That is something that he has to be worried about. And I'm more than willing to sack an Atlas if it means completely denying his econ backbone. So that's what I'm going to do this turn. After purging last turn, I'm going to play Paywall. Of course, purging was a necessity because I cannot afford to have him see 7 cards off the top of R&D. He knows that it's a Spiderweb that is on R&D because that's the only ice that I have. So here I doubly ice up R&D to make sure that there are no more medium decks available. Then I go for the Corporate Town. So by this point he should know that that's a Corporate Town. I could bluff here and go for the Atlas instead, but I'd rather save the Atlas, mostly because he doesn't know that I actually have another agenda in my hand. It is a pretty good bluff. It's like Jens Eriksson winning Worlds. If you watched it very long ago, I think it was 2012 or 2013 Worlds. He was playing HB. He mulliganed into a hand with 3 or 4 agendas, which is more or less a death sentence for anyone. But he played it very well, and it got to the point where his opponent was locking his R&D, and his opponent said, "I don't think there are agendas in HQ. I've been locking your R&D the whole game. So I'm just gonna keep running R&D," but it turns out that he could fast advance everything from HQ because he was so flooded early on, and he just won a game that seemed unwinnable because he had too many agendas that didn't contribute to his defense or economy. So after finding my Global Food Initiative in archives, he goes for HQ for the win, but does not see the 1 and 2 Atlas. So I got very lucky here. Hopefully this should convince him that I don't have any agendas in hand. That would make life much easier for me. Then he goes for my remote and attempts to trash my Corporate Town, which he should. So there we go. Here I calculate whether to res the Corporate Town. After some calculations, I realized that even after resing Corporate Town and forcing him to spend 3 credits on the Mimic to break through Tour Guide, he still will have enough credits to trash the Corporate Town thanks to Wizard's ability, which is pretty annoying. So I allow him to go through and see the Corporate Town. He's down to 3 credits. He has to spend 2 of them to trash Corporate Town, leaving him at 1 credit. That's pretty good. Alright, so now I can more or less safely place the Atlas in my remote. And that's exactly what I'm gonna do right here. If he hasn't been paying too much attention to his medium decks, he would not realize that he would not realize that this is actually an agenda. It's pretty hard to tell from the other side of the board, especially when you think that you have locked your opponent for the longest time with that big medium deck a few turns ago. So that's an Atlas in the remote. It would cost him 3 credits to get through my remote, plus 1 to access the card. So it is a huge deterrence for him. So he goes for the easier route, which is 1-turn destruction on HQ. I don't mind at this point. He's just destroying a duplicate copies of cards that I already have on the board, and he runs archives for nothing. But he does get a data sucker token, and that's a bit of a worry because now my main win condition is sniping his entire rig off with Archer, which seemed to be placed in the wrong place. I placed the Archer on the team sponsorship, which he isn't going to trash anytime soon. So I'm never going to bait a run on that team sponsorship, unfortunately. Here I score the Atlas to bring me to 6 points. What do I install? I chose to install the public support in remote from archives. There was very little else I could install. The worst thing is my mandatory draw was on an Oaktown renovation. Goodness me, of all things I drew a public agenda. Normally the play here would be to install an agenda into the remote if I draw it from R&D. So that would help me get rid of the agenda flood from R&D with HQ, which is a huge problem because he can walk into HQ for 1 credit only. Enigma being completely useless. Now, the problem with a public agenda is if I place it in the remote, I'm going to lose the game outright because he's on match point and because my remote is too porous for him. If there was an Ash or Betty in the remote, life would have been better. And it goes back to the point, why did I use the Betty so early on when it wasn't needed? Of course, he runs HQ here, knowing that it's the most vulnerable server, and he gets the agenda. Well played to my opponent. He knew where the agendas were almost all the time, and I just couldn't defend the onslaught. Bad luck for me for drawing the 3rd Oaktown at that point in the game. I really needed to see a non-agenda card from R&D on the turn I scored the 3rd Atlas. I did not. If you watch my old videos talking about Wizard's ability, it warps the game so much. As the co-op, you're forced to defend your remotes when you usually don't. And that cost me the game, because the ice that should have went on my centrals, i.e. the archer, was instead dedicated to a server which he would never run again. And that was my biggest mistake. If I could destroy his rig, I could have made a comeback, but that wasn't to happen. Another big reason why I lost is because my avenue for scoring agendas, which is my upgrades, were all trashed due to my misplays. I let him into HQ, and his random access early on cost me an Ash that I should have used to protect my agendas early. Late game, the Betty should have been there in my remote, when it was, and it wasn't. In both cases, when you consider Gagarin with 15 influence, 3 influence is fixed on Jackson Howard, so essentially a 12 influence to play with. Of those 12 influence, more than half, 7 influence is spent between Ash and Betty. For a deck that spends so much influence on upgrades, you can see how important they are, and not having them to score my agenda safely cost me the game. So let's talk about the ice in this deck, which seemed pretty weak in this game. To be fair, they did a lot of work. My opponent was struggling with dealing with my ice because he only found 1 parasite throughout the entire game, even though he was running 2 clone chips and 2 parasites. He dug through most of his deck but couldn't find any more parasites, which was pretty painful for him. I completely don't mind Tour Guide being knocked off by Parasite because I'm spending 2 credits for a Tour Guide res and he spends 2 credits to install Parasite. It's a fair trade. I'm breaking even. It's more painful for him to trash things like Spiderweb and, if I included it, Quicksand in this deck, because those cost more to res. Tour Guide only costs 2 to res, so it actually is not that bad, even though it's a Parasite magnet. And with Gagarin, you can be sure that Tour Guide has multiple subroutines, even though everyone plays Mimic. Once you get 2 or more subroutines with it, it gets pretty nasty to break. In a deck that's already taxing the runner like crazy for running remotes. So yeah, the not so good ice are those without multiple subroutines. Enigma has 2 subroutines, which is nice, until the opponent plays a York and completely bypasses it, which was very annoying and cost me the game. HQ was very porous the entire game, with only Ice Wall to protect it. That really should have been a Quicksand. Merumati is awful outside of HQ. I included only 1 copy in this deck. My intention with a single Merumati is that whenever I draw it, it goes on HQ automatically. Not a very good idea, because in this game what happened was I found Enigma and Ice Wall on HQ before I drew the Merumati. At that point, my thought process was, I don't need any more ice on HQ. The Merumati has to go to the remote to tax the runner further. And it didn't end up doing much. It was an overpriced Ice Wall. Probably should be an Ice Wall or a Quicksand instead. So yeah, I'm still tweaking the Ice Suite, which I think is probably the weakest aspect of this deck. But I do see a lot of potential in taxing the runner out with Gagarin's ability, and it's probably one of the better Wayland decks you can make at this point. Not having the Scorch package is not a big deal, honestly, because a lot of runners are resilient to Flatline nowadays, and it's pretty hard to get scorched off in any case. But you can try. Not gonna stop you. Taking out those deck slots is a pretty big deal though, and having to spend multiple influence on Seesaws. worth thinking about. Thanks for watching Happy Net Running. Goodbye.